Healthcare Money Campfire Stories by Dr. Eric Bricker. Chapter 3. The second time I've been attacked. During the third year of medical school, students do required rotations lasting from 1 to 3 months in the major specialties of doctoring: internal medicine, surgery, pediatrics, OBGYN, etc. Psychiatry is one of these rotations. I was fortunate at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. I was able to have first pick of where I did each of my third-year rotations. I had this priority because I did an independent research project while in medical school. As previously mentioned, the University of Illinois College of Medicine sent its students all over Chicago for the different rotations. Locations varied from the main university hospital to the famous Cook County Hospital to the West Side VA to various community hospitals throughout the city and suburbs. Each of these hospitals was known for having particularly good rotations in certain specialties, largely based on the quality of teaching from the attending physicians. For psychiatry, Illinois Medical Center was known as the best hospital because of one doctor who ran the entire medical student rotation, Dr. S. Dr. S was a foreign-born and foreign-trained psychiatrist who did subsequent training after coming to the United States. He was in his late 50s and had been a practicing psychiatrist in America for 30 years. He was even active in both local and national politics. Dr. S was kind, soft-spoken, and exceedingly patient. He was everything you would expect in a psychiatrist. He wore brown slacks, a suit jacket, dress shirt, and no tie. Often he would accessorize his outfit with a silk paisley neck scarf, something like out of a late 1960s movie. He had graying brown hair that was thinning on top, which he styled with a comb-over. He had a mustache. He looked how an old-school psychiatrist would look. All he needed was a pipe. Our month-long rotation at Illinois Medical Center had 3 students, Kathy, Ellen, and me. On our first morning, we arrived in the lobby of the hospital as instructed and waited for the secretary from the psychiatry department to meet us. After approaching us and introducing herself, she took us up the elevator to the inpatient psychiatry unit. Psychiatry units are unique in hospitals in that they are locked. There are cameras on both sides of the entry door with monitors at the nurse's station for the clerk to watch. Our secretary escort pushed the intercom button and asked to be buzzed in. "The new medical students are here for Dr. S," she said. We heard the door buzz. Our escort pushed it open and we walked in. I was not sure what to expect, but it looked like a regular hospital floor. There was no one in the hallway, and we took an immediate right and walked down a corridor past about 4 patient rooms to the nurse's station. Unlike most nurse's stations, which were open to the hospital hallway, this nurse's station was enclosed in glass to the ceiling and had a locked door as well. Within the glass, you could see the chicken wire pattern of metal meant to reinforce the glass and prevent it from shattering. The reason for the shatterproof glass and locked door was to prevent any of the patients from forcefully entering the nurse's station. The head nurse, referred to as the charge nurse, informed us that Dr. S was seeing patients across the street at his office in the morning and would be over at the hospital in the afternoon. She recommended we go to a small instruction/family meeting room and read our psychiatry rotation textbook. So we did. The morning was uneventful. We sat and read and engaged in occasional small talk. Nurses, techs, and patients would walk past the open door to the room where we were. Rather than the usual hospital gowns that tied in the back, all the patients wore what looked like sky blue pajamas. There was an indoor smoking room where the patients took smoke breaks. The room had similar shatterproof glass and was small, about 8 feet by 10 feet. There were scheduled smoke breaks when about 15 people would cram into this small room. They were given about 10 minutes. Many of the patients on the floor had schizophrenia, and people with this condition typically smoke a lot. In the amount of time that they were given for their smoke break, each patient could easily smoke multiple cigarettes. It was amazing to see the smoking room become incredibly hazy with smoke of 30-plus cigarettes in a 10-minute period of time. Then they would all shuffle out and walk back to their rooms. The smoke would stay thick in the room for a long time. I was later told there was a vent that eventually cleared out the smoky air. We went down to the hospital cafeteria for lunch and then returned to the psychiatry unit. We were buzzed in, walked down to the nurse's station, and were buzzed in there as well. The charge nurse informed us that Dr. S was on the floor seeing a patient and to wait here, and he would meet us when he was finished. We waited about 5 minutes. Suddenly, there was shouting coming from the hallway near the locked entrance to the psychiatry unit. The shouting was one man's voice only. It was mostly unintelligible. We saw 3 male nurses through the shatterproof glass of the nurses' station run in the direction of the shouting. They were each about 6 feet tall. 2 small techs quickly rushed to the outside of the door of the nurses' station. We heard a buzz, and then they entered. My fellow medical students and I looked at each other with an expression of alarm and confusion on our faces. We did not move. "Call security," the charge nurse exclaimed to the clerk on the phone. The shouting continued. Again, only the one man's voice was heard. However, this time there was the sound of a struggle and the chirping of rubber-soled shoes on the floor, like during a basketball game. Less than a minute later, a man ran to the door of the nurses' station and was immediately buzzed in. He almost dove into one of the rolling office chairs. The chair rolled a couple of feet from his momentum. It was an older gentleman, brown pants, brown suit jacket, graying black hair styled in a comb-over that had been tousled and was sticking up and flopped over in the wrong direction, so that it looked like the crest of a rooster. It was Dr. S. His eyes were wide, and you could see the white fully around his dark iris and pupils. "This is only the second time I've been attacked in 25 years, he said, still breathless from his sprint down the hall. Eventually, the shouting stopped. The clerk picked up the phone. We had been cleared to leave the nurses' station. Dr. S. did not introduce himself, and neither did we, but it was obvious that we were his new medical students for the month. He said it would be a good idea if we just went home for the day, and he would meet us back in the unit the next morning. As we walked down the hall, we passed by a patient room that had 3 male nurses we had seen run by the nurses' station. 4 security guards in their navy blue police-looking uniforms were there too. They were standing around a bed with a man lying flat on his back, both arms and both legs in restraints at the head and foot of the bed. His eyes were closed. He was not moving. He was breathing calmly but rapidly. I could see one of the nurses going to dispose of a needle and syringe. It turned out the nurse had just given the man who had attacked Dr. S. an injection of a sedative. We left. As soon as the door closed behind us to the psychiatry unit, Ellen exclaimed, "Holy crap, what was that?" "I have no idea," I replied. "I don't know that I want to come back tomorrow," Ellen said. The next day, Dr. S. was all smiles and a mark of civility and equanimity. He explained that the man who had attacked him was one of his patients with schizophrenia who, in a fit of psychosis, struck him and tackled him to the ground. Dr. S. then told us the story of when he had been attacked by a patient for the first time 25 years earlier. It was in the psychiatry unit of a VA hospital also in Chicago. He apologized for us having had that event happen on our first day. The next month was an amazing experience. Probably 80% of the patients on the floor had schizophrenia and were either a danger to themselves or to others. Another 10% were people with depression who were either suicidal or had psychotic features that made them dangerous. The remaining 10% were people with bipolar disorder who were having a manic episode, and they were dangerous either to themselves or to others as well. Dr. S. even had one patient with such prolonged and severe depression that he was almost catatonic. The patient ate very little. He would not get out of bed. He typically refused to talk, and if he did, it was only 1 or 2 word answers. He was a middle-aged man, well over 6 feet tall and gaunt. Dr. S. said the patient was a doctor himself who had gone to a medical conference in another city and upon his return fell into his current depressed state. After being in the hospital for several months and having many different medication regimens, Dr. S. said he needed to try a different approach. He wanted to have electroconvulsive therapy, also known as ECT, performed on the gentleman. Just like it sounds, ECT involves hooking electrodes up to a patient and shocking them so it causes them to have a seizure. In theory, the seizure would snap them out of their depression. ECT was used more frequently in the past, and Dr. S. had seen it be successful with other patients. The hospital where we were did not have a machine for ECT, so Dr. S. arranged for the patient to be moved to another hospital about a mile away. The patient would then come back the same day. In the procedure room at this other hospital, an anesthesiologist had attached monitors and electrodes to the patient. The patient was unconscious. Dr. S. flipped a switch on the ECT machine and turned a small red dial. The anesthesiologist had a blood pressure cuff around the arm of the patient. He had given the patient a paralytic medication through his IV so that he would not move and fall off the gurney when he had the seizure. However, He had intentionally fully inflated the blood pressure cuff so the blood was temporarily not flowing to the patient's left forearm and hand. Because the blood was not flowing to the hand, the paralytic medication was not delivered to those muscles, and therefore his hand was not paralyzed. We could see his hand rapidly twitch from the seizure he was having in his brain. The seizure only lasted several seconds. That was it. We left. When I saw the patient the next day, he was the same. Dr. S was not pleased, but he said it could take some time for the potential therapeutic effect of the ECT to occur. The rotation concluded. We soon took the psychiatry test that all students take after completing their month-long rotation. I received almost a perfect score. I write this not as a reflection on myself, but rather as a reflection on the instruction by Dr. S. He was so detailed, thorough, and kind. It was impossible not to learn. Kathy and Ellen also received exceedingly high scores. Several months later, it was the end of my third year of medical school. I had come to find out from speaking with other students that my rotation with Dr. S was his second to last for the entire medical school. The hospital administration had shut down the medical student training program in psychiatry because they wanted Dr. S to spend all of his time with patients and not with medical students. Supposedly, Dr. S had told the last group of students that the hospital was under new ownership and that the new owners needed him to bill more. Lesson learned. Financial decisions at a hospital impact medical training. Educating future doctors is a money-losing proposition. If monetary goals are given top priority, short-term economic gain could come at the long-term cost of decreased medical student experiences and training. Dr. S and dozens of my attending physicians had sacrificed countless hours teaching me instead of seeing more patients that they could bill. My tuition could not have made up for the difference in revenue. They did a noble service, and I am grateful. Chapter 4. Dr. T. During the fourth year of medical school, it is common for students to do visiting rotations at academic medical centers other than their own. These visiting rotations are often used as an opportunity for a fourth-year student to see if the medical center is one where they would like to apply for residency. Given my interest in healthcare policy and being from the Washington, D.C. area originally, I did visiting rotations at both Georgetown University and George Washington University, more commonly referred to as just GW. Medical students can choose a specific area for their visiting rotation, and I chose infectious diseases at GW. Each rotation was a month long, and I had scheduled both rotations in D.C. back to back. I packed up my car and drove from Chicago to D.C. At GW, we had a team of 4 our infectious disease rotation, 2 fourth-year medical students, 1 internal medicine resident, 2 infectious disease fellows, and 1 infectious disease attending physician. Our attending physician was Dr. T. Dr. T was a Filipino-American woman in her 60s. She had shoulder-length black hair, deep lines of experience on her face, and a countenance that went from very serious to smiling to very serious again, all within a second. It's like she would allow herself a moment of joy and then get back to work. She shuffled as she walked. She wore a long white doctor's coat over a floral print dress. Dr. T had been born and raised in the Philippines. She had attended medical school there as well. She had come to the United States decades ago and had been practicing medicine at GW ever since. She had even been the head of the infectious disease division for a time before passing the position on to another doctor. Our infectious disease team would see patients in the hospital as requested by other services, surgery, the ICU, the general medicine floor, etc. We would evaluate patients, examine lab reports, even go to the microbiology lab to look at specimens under the microscope to identify bacteria or parasites. We would then recommend an antibiotic regimen and monitor the patient's progress on the IV medication. It was a busy, fast-paced month. The mornings were early and the days were long. Dr. T spoke quickly and intensely. She was both stern and warm. She would correct us sharply, but end her quote-unquote feedback with a smile. She knew many of the nurses on the floor by name, which was unusual. Most attending physicians do not know the nurses' names. All the nurses knew who Dr. T was. She knew all the other attendings as well. They would all give a brief wave and say hello to her by name everywhere in the hospital. The ICU, in pathology, to look at slides, in radiology, to look at films. This degree of familiarity with a physician at a large academic medical center is somewhat rare. There are hundreds of attending physicians. So much of the communication is run through the residents and fellows that the attendings rarely talk to each other, and if they do, they often never have met or are mere acquaintances. But not Dr. T. You could tell she was somewhat of the matron of the hospital. As we approached the end of our month together, Dr. T said she was going to take us out to a fancy Indian cuisine restaurant for lunch. This event was often a tradition at teaching hospitals. The attending physician would take their team out for lunch or dinner at the end of working together for the month. This happened at my medical school and at Johns Hopkins Hospital, where I did residency too. The restaurant was only a short walk from the hospital. We sat at a table outside on a second-floor covered patio. It was a beautiful sunny day, cooler with low humidity after the previous night's rain. We ordered. We asked Dr. T more about her story and her personal life. It turned out she lived close to where my grandparents did in a Maryland suburb of D.C. It occurred to me that Dr. T had been working at GW for so long that she was probably there in the early 1980s. GW Hospital is famous for being the place where the Secret Service took President Ronald Reagan after he was shot by John Hinckley in March of 1981, only 2 months after he had been inaugurated. Were you there? I asked. Yes, Dr. T answered. Did you see the Secret Service in the hospital? I pressed. Yes, she answered again. She continued. President Reagan was one of my patients. I was part of the group of doctors that took care of him after he had been shot. Wow. Dr. T had been a part of history. We had worked together the whole month and it had never come up that she had never mentioned it. In fact, GW is the closest hospital to the White House, and I had noticed several of the doctors had pins on their white coats to signify that they were part of a special group that would take care of the president should he come to the hospital. Had Dr. T and the doctors and nurses and staff at GW not saved President Reagan, we would have had George H.W. Bush as a president much sooner. President Reagan would have been president for only about 60 days. It was the last time a president had been shot. I asked Dr. T more questions, but she said, "We have talked enough about that." I knew to stop asking. We concluded lunch, and in a few days we ended our month-long rotation together. President Reagan was one lucky guy to have Dr. T as his physician. Lesson learned. Foreign-born and foreign-trained doctors, nurses, and medical staff are some of the unsung heroes of our healthcare system. We literally could not survive without them. There is an economic reason why the U.S. has so many foreign healthcare workers. The labor market for healthcare is subject to supply and demand like other areas of the economy. There is greater demand for healthcare professionals than there is supply within the U.S. The reason for this shortage are government regulation, insufficiently skilled Americans, and a lack of interest by workers in the U.S. The pay is good, but the hours are bad, and the work itself can be unpleasant. Our country alone does not produce enough people to take care of all the unwell Americans, including the president.